As someone who has spent many years researching, managing, and also advising on organizations of all shapes and sizes, I tend to think of Pangea 2.0 as a global society, a global village. And in that village, we are becoming increasingly interdependent. The good news is that what that interdependency and also connectivity on a global scale means that small interest groups, such as ornithologists, people interested in weaving, various other activities, can actually get together as global communities using the latest communications technologies and, of course, social media. The bad news is that those systems equally facilitate groups such as pedophiles and terrorists. And in my view, it is this kind of extremism that is the major challenge of tomorrow's peaceful and harmonious, diverse society. The antidote to that is to focus on the common ground rather than on the differences. Those are the techniques that are often used in negotiation and arbitration. And I think these are going to be very important skills in the Pangea 2.0 vision, where we all live much closer together in this interconnected global village. The big question is, can we adapt, and can we adapt fast enough? One of the problems is that we have a natural tendency towards One of the problems is that we have a natural tendency towards polarization. That's how the brain has evolved. So you can imagine the hunter-gatherer, he or she in the jungle, 150, 200,000 years ago, suddenly sees a big shape moving in the bushes. Wah! Quick decision, fight or flight, run like hell. That's our instinctive reaction, and that has served us very well indeed. That's what psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 thinking. Subconscious, very fast, doesn't distinguish between black and white. It's either danger or friendly. If that hunter-gatherer was engaging System 2 thinking, which is very much more deliberative, logical, takes a longer time, takes more energy, and went and said, oh, something moved over there. Is it friendly? Is it cuddly? Oh, perhaps it's a tiger, I don't know. And by the time they reach the decision, the tiger's on top of them, and their lunch. And so clearly, the System 1 is the one that's actually helped us evolve and survived. The others didn't live to tell the tale. So that sort of natural effect that we have in terms of seeing things in slightly black and white terms is further enhanced by what's called the halo effect. So another psychologist, Edward Thorndike, described this effect. And I think we all actually do that to some extent. And that is that the first impression you have of someone tends to influence our overall view of their character. A sort of all or nothing. Again, it's a polarized picture. If we think of two of the monster human beings of the 20th century, Hitler and Stalin, it's very difficult to think of Hitler, who is responsible for so many millions of deaths, as actually having a very fond relationship with his dog Blondie and her 5 puppies. Equally, we think about Stalin, who actually was responsible for more deaths than even Hitler was. At dinner parties, apparently Stalin was really charming, delightful, an ideal host. Difficult to imagine that people can actually have those shades of grey. And it is this tendency that we have towards polarization that also makes it easier for groups to become extremists and also for other people to follow and support them. The good news is that there are many mechanisms out there that actually can counter that and help us refocus on the center ground, on the common ground. One example where I had a personal experience was working as a European Commission advisor to the Polish government for 6 years after the collapse of communism and the restructuring of the new democratic state of Poland. Just to give you a little bit of context, it was on the 13th of December 1981 when the Polish nation woke up to the dulcet tones of General Jaruzelski over the radio and television announcing that martial law had been imposed across the whole country. People looked out of the windows and they could see hundreds of tanks lined up in the streets of all the major cities in Poland. By the end of that day, several thousand opponents of the single-party totalitarian regime found themselves imprisoned and remained in jail for the next 3 or 4 years. Amongst them were Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who later became the first democratic Prime Minister of Poland in recent times, and also Lech Wałęsa, who is very well known and was the leader of the Solidarity movement, which grew up around that time. By 1989, the communist system was beginning to crumble and wasn't able to stand up against the joint opposition of the Solidarity movement, who are trade unionists and also intellectuals and also students. And the General Jaruzelski and ministers of the government at the time and the leaders of the Solidarity movement came together to famous meetings in Gdańsk called the Round Table Meeting. The shape of that table is actually quite significant, and I'll come back to that shortly. In the following months, the communist government capitulated, and Tadeusz Mazowiecki came in and led the first democratic government in 1990. Over the following years, there was a proliferation of political parties. As you can imagine, after a vacuum of 50 years, all these different groups didn't even believe that they would actually get this form of independence. So there were originally something like 25 or 30 political parties. Gradually they coalesced, and over a period of 5 or 6 years, this reduced down to about 8 or 10, what I'd call serious political parties. And in that time, the governments changed, but each of those governments was a coalition over a different range of those parties. Now, the press at the time, and I will have a bit of criticism of the press here and there during this talk, the press at the time was, particularly the Western press, was predicting that these coalition parties were going to collapse, that the whole system was in turmoil, it was an utter mess, and Poland and the other neighboring countries, the post-communist countries, really wouldn't get anywhere. And of course the issue is that bad news sells newspapers. The reality was that although on the surface it appeared that those coalition parties are changing and melding and forming and storming, there was a common vision, there was a common ground amongst all those politicians. They were all agreed on 3 priorities. One was to rebuild the economy of the country. Number 2 was to become full members of Europe, and eventually they succeeded and became members of the European Union in 2004. And also for the security of the country, because of its turbulent history, membership of NATO was very important. So that was the common ground across these 15 or 20 different political parties. The differences were the state of the church, for example, in the future constitution. How to deal with those members of the communist parties who were the oppressors in the previous period, and various other distinctions. But the wisdom of those politicians was that they met and discussed their differences in a form of harmonious dialogue. And that's what actually made it possible to have a bloodless revolution in Eastern Europe in 1990, which led to the Czech Republic, Hungary, the Berlin Wall being brought down, and so forth. So despite the fact that in that period of 6 years, I served 10 different ministers as personal advisor, and my areas of specialism were public administration reform, building the new institutions of the new democratic state. It was this common ground, this continuity, that actually made the frequent changes in government less important. Even to some extent, where there was a strong economic policy put forward by an academic, Leszek Balcerowicz, he actually served as finance minister for different governments of different political flavor, because they all agreed that these were the common objectives that they shared. I come back to Tadeusz Mazowiecki. His famous statement at the time was to draw a thick line under the past, to forgive those members of the Communist Party who had oppressed freedom, and to focus on the future. I'll never forget, I was at a garden party at the British Embassy. They had Scottish pipers playing there. It was a very grand occasion. And I was standing right next to Tadeusz Mazowiecki. And suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I noticed General Jaruzelski, the one who introduced martial law 9 years earlier, marching over towards Tadeusz Mazowiecki. So I stepped back instinctively, waiting for the sparks to fly. And to my amazement, they greeted each other with open arms like long-lost brothers. And what I'm underlining is it was this ability to put the past behind you and to look at the common ground for the future. So the same picture one has seen in the Velvet Revolution, as it was called, in the Czech Republic and in other parts of Eastern Europe, and also in South Africa after the collapse of apartheid. And Nelson Mandela introduced the Trust and Reconciliation Committee. And again, the effects were very similar, due to the fact that he was suggesting you to draw a thick line under the past and focus on the future. Now, I come to the issue of language and compromise, because to be able to work together and share that common ground, compromise is an important element of that. But the problem is that, and the slides seem to be working. Sorry. The issue with compromise is that it has negative connotations. People tend to think of compromise as compromise for losers. It means that you've failed. When you talk about a system, maybe a safety or a security system being compromised, that means it's failed, it's broken. But if we go back to the original definitions of compromise, and here you've got the Middle English definition, it is very much more consensual. It is talking about a mutual consent to arbitration, where you identify and work together for the common ground. And this is the important bit, that you don't ignore, you acknowledge the differences, the different views, what's in the wings and the extremes, and work together to see if it's possible to accommodate those. And in some instances, the parties need to make a compromise. But I would call it a constructive compromise, because there are so many examples where people and organizations have compromised and in the end have actually gained more than they would have done if they won. This attitude of winner takes all. We've seen the historical effect of that after the Versailles Agreement following the First World War, where it was very much an anti-German, it sort of crushed the German nation. And the kickback of that, and many historians point to this, were the foundations of the Second World War. We have a similar situation in Ukraine today. And that is a result of the Yalta Agreement in 1945, where there was major geopolitical engineering by the Allies and completely changed the boundaries of Ukraine. And that is one of the factors that is leading to today's difficulties. So what I'm proposing is actually a change in attitude towards compromise and actually thinking of it as a positive thing, as gaining on the benefits rather than the losses. Now, one of the important things is the impact of organizational design. And it's both in the physical dimension and in the intangible dimension. The physical dimension is the actual physical space we live in and how things can be designed for collaboration. But if you look at the House of Commons chamber in the British Parliament, you have the government party on one side, you have the opposition on the other side. It's a very adversarial positioning of people within the debating chamber. There are also red lines down either side, and members of Parliament are not allowed to cross that line during debates. The distance between those two lines is 2 sword lengths. It's from the days when MPs were allowed to bear arms. And that is carried on through into today's Parliament. And of course, it's the sort of adversarial situation that, again, the press, the newspapers love. That's why, for example, Prime Minister's Question Time is so popular, because it's almost like a boxing match, really. The real business of Parliament actually takes place in the committees, which, funnily enough, are actually more in more rounder tables or horseshoe-shaped tables. But I'm drawing the contrast here between that rather sort of adversarial space as opposed to the round table of the United Nations. Now, also, if we look at coalition government, when the government formed a coalition after the last election in 2010, all the political pundits, almost without exception, were predicting that it wouldn't last very long. Well, we're now only 1 year away from the next general election, and it looks like the government will have actually run the full course of 5 years. Now, what is interesting, when you look at the statistics, is what I call the representation gap. So Conservatives, 36% of the vote, actually got 49% of the seats. Now, when you look at previous elections, you get a very similar pattern where a smaller representation of around 36 to 40% actually gives you 50, 60 or 62% of the vote. Labour 29, 30, 42, Liberal Democrats 23% of the vote and only 9% of the seats. It's even in the coalition agreement, both parties agree that the system is broken. But putting that aside, I'm not trying to make a political statement here, but what is important is that if you look at the representation of the coalition on the bottom line, then suddenly you see 59% of the vote is actually represented by those members of Parliament in the coalition. And amazingly enough, they've got virtually the same number of seats. So the democratic deficit is almost zero with the coalition government, whereas with the first past the post majority system, it's the other way around. The other things I want to talk about are, which is on the good news side of things, there are many examples of organizations that are actually supporting collaboration between employees, employers. For example, in a recent report last year, the study I carried out together with the RSA looking at flexible working. And the surprise was that it wasn't just employers having to give away autonomy to allow flexible working in order to attract the right kind of people and good talent to their organizations. But our study of over 3,000 managers and employees actually showed how many benefits there are to both sides, both employers and employees. Other examples are the interfaith meetings that regularly take place, and also some of the peace initiatives between Israel and Palestine. And just rounding off, I would point out the importance of social media. Social media, sometimes referred to as the fifth estate, is not focused on selling newspapers, but actually can be open to different groups, and there are now many, many people who are, I would call, in the common ground, who are allowing, who are bringing out the common ground in society. I'm sorry, I'm just watching that I'm out of time. So the social media isn't hampered in the same way as the traditional press, and I would say that is the hope for supporting and promoting the middle ground. So I would round off by saying that we need to develop mechanisms that help us focus on the mutual gains rather than the losses, to design our organizations so that they support, both spatially and in other ways, dialogue and collaboration, and also find mechanisms that enable us to seek and, importantly, maintain the common ground. And this is really very important, not just for us, but for our children and for their children's children. Thank you.